The false moralization of those seeking godhood through the KKK wizard terrorism, asserting themselves under their Jewish structures as gods, manufactured the illegal prohibition in order to generate the barring of alcohol, which allowed them to corner the market, and having released the prohibition eventually exponentially increased their profits, having cornered alcohol as a viable market, which is the same thing with all of the variations of drugs. These are non-congressional power of the purse resources for the KKK operations and contracts to systematically get protected, as the words of with Epstein being arrested by sheriffs. Um, it, he's beyond your pay grade, asserting the position of the ignoring the separation of jurisdictions in favor of the system of their insurrectionist spells, which is the manufactured position that they are the exclusive maintainer of the black market outside of the market fixtures. Now, the position from Zach's version of the Hegelian dialectic, where the snake is eating its own tail. There are two snakes, and each of them are eating each other's tail, which is manifest in the never ending story symbol or its pendant. At which point it symbolizes the position of capitalism consistently eating communism. And the position of capitalism persistently eating communism manufactures the stabilizing position of being able to understand the functional market values and prices in order to affect the communism, which is inherently ignorant of the thing in favor of the corruption, which generates the inability for it to competently stabilize without the existence of the capitalism, which is what the white nationalists had historically been relying on when Mattis's character systematically stabilized his version of the black market through the unstable stable structure, which requires the lower percentage value in order to rely on the larger capitalist structure, which exponentially growing by protecting itself is a parasite which is growing into the other, which collapses the other, which it needed, at which point the complete collapse of the entire system is the inevitable conclusion of the communism consuming the capitalism, at which point it cannot transfer, at which point these functions of the black market, such as their rape culture, or their pedophile market, or their narcotics market, withstanding, or whichever black market you want to refer to, which they are specifically and exclusively responsible for, with protections against prosecution of the base structure, except for the acceleration of prosecutions in the war against X system, which increases the value of the product. So the harder it is in order to acquire the thing, the harder it is to deliver the product, the more expensive it's going to be. At which point, these are price accelerant functions, which, if they were going to sustain themselves in the war on David, they would have had to have planned for an exponential amount of time, which would have compelled them into the position of early legalization, which their exchange with David's character when he was a toddler um, had the argument that they had to conduct these operations, which is fundamentally bullshit, but the counter argument is obviously anything the government sells, the public has to be able to buy. At which point they don't have the authority to criminalize what they have certified as a government product. At which point the system of their compelled legalization creates a back and forth exchange as David is intelligence oversight, limiting the function of those operations. At which point, him fighting or not fighting, it's the basis of his hyperexhaustion on whether or not to focus on that or to be more strategic and competent in the application of the funding. At which point, David, not exhausting himself, doesn't really care about those black market operations outside of the more fundamentally dangerous ones. At which point, the position was assumed that they would have clearly legalized marijuana. They would have clearly legalized all sexuality. They would have clearly legalized um, the crack cocaine and polygamy and the rest of it, just to fundamentally hit their nut in order to fundamentally be competent in funding, as the existence of the accelerant of the price in the prosecutions and law enforcement against it is the dividing of the resource to the other departments, which has to systematically be ignored, as they need to be able to hit their quota of sales in order to have their launderable resources. At which point, them acquiring their funding for this had to have started their investment into the system in the acceleration of pushing their products, which actively negates or diminishes the dangerous products because of the easier investment into the less dangerous products. At which point, the less effective or the less effective subversions, the less damaging products, which wouldn't have been as noticeable in David's research through his School of Hard Knocks from the rehab centers, which would have actively studied the effects of the addictions and the subversions of each of the products in question and all of its variations, at which point the contest between them would compel David to be more picky about what he fights them over, and they, being able to choose the settlement on this, would hyper accelerate in the fewer damages, higher producible products, at which point they're likely to have subverted their other investments, such as the rape culture, in favor of their easier to defend marijuana, at which point they would have legalized and captured the market in order to hyper accelerate their funding in the war on David, in order to have acquired enough resources to potentially maximize their ability to kill David in the War on Terror campaign, at least in its final contest. At which point, these exponential advancements in the market would have protected the system, at which point the aggressions against Hunter Biden, being guilty of whatever the things that they were saying he was guilty of, like the cocaine or the prostitutes, these are less significant issues in reality of the actual American functions. As the Confederates would have had to have made those settlements, those policies would have been reneged, making them no longer credible violations. Now, selling out the country to its enemies, such as siding with the white nationalist Confederacy in its plot to eradicate the United States government, this is less forgivable. Treason, sedition, and high crimes is less forgivable. The plan to usurp American equipment, evade an ally such as Israel, so you could eradicate their genetic line from the entire planet as you hunt them around the world, less forgivable. At which point you engage in these contests of calculating their uh, production rates, and this would include the reduction of their poisoning of those products, as the poisoning of alcohol had been conducted in order to make this aversion. The poisoning of marijuana has actually been conducted. The poisoning of certain meats under the wizard of communism and other functions along these lines of whatever they permit or contract on the black market in order to subvert, in order to control the stock market prices and sales and distributions on the basis of avoiding the injury of the various subversions and poisons, generates their control of the general market, which they would have to diminish in order to hit their nut. At which point, they, giving up their dirty tricks in order to receive exclusive profits, would have actively been conducting these actions. At which point, I'm not sure how this would affect the drug, tobacco, arms department specifically, but in general, most of their responsibilities would be exponentially reduced, which made them hate David as the natural reduction of their purpose and powers is an attack against their office by virtue of pure attrition in order to be more effective against the overarching goal in the destruction of the United States. At which point, the ATF, understanding this, hating David and retaliating against David in the estimate, along with other Homeland Security double agents, would actively, wittingly be complying with the overthrow of the government by treason, sedition, and high crimes as disloyal to the country exclusively on the basis that they know that David compelling them into the reaction or actively making themselves vulnerable to the enforcement against them as this hyper vulnerability would make them subject to the general public, at which point their compliance is necessary to the existence of the Republic. And so they would have to choose to subordinate themselves and to dissolve into the Americans or to openly rebel, which is the plan that they have in the funding of the war on terror on the terrorist side, as the white nationalists have actively conducted their long-term planning of the phantom cells and the control of their contacts in the Middle East in order to fund these alternative CIA operations, which are basically subordinate militia forces, which have a feudalistic, tentative, uneasy alliance with those systems, but they have long-term goals through the phantom cells, which would allow them to engage in their higher priority goals as long as they engage in those primary investments, at which point the accelerants of making them adversarial or aggressive in appearance towards the Americans would systematically be used in the aggression against them, in the retaliation against the aggression manufactured by the white nationalists. At which point they would be kiting the Americans into uh, killing their tentative allies. Uh, at which point Dave Smith's statement of whoever you, if you want to know who your next America's next enemy is going to be, look at who we're funding right now, is legitimately a competent and well thought through point, which is specifically and overwhelmingly beyond accurate, as it is fundamental to the concept that they are perpetually engaging in a racket. Now, the Cold War and the contest with the Russians uh, collapsed the Soviet Union into the position of having overspent and invested into the potential fight, at which point that system of hyperaccelerance of the investment into those structures uh, manufactures their hyperacceleration or increasing the RPMs in making those investments in the United States, as the Americans are just as much their enemy as the Russians were in the Cold War, which is important to understand as their systems hate David under their projection for making Russia strong and benign. And the investment into the contest, having acquired the advantage of David making his economic treaty with the former Soviet Union countries and its satellites, which would collapse into the structure of his insurance, would allow him to have stabilized them in a non aggressive world order. So their original treaties and the original order facilitated the system of securities is the primary thing estimated in Putin's proxy war functions, which is specifically in line from what I've been told is what he assumes the original treaties would have indicated his responsibilities would have been. So, within a reasonable margin of error, he's trying to keep the original agreement, but he doesn't want to admit to it because the white nationalists will retaliate. And if the Americans don't win, then the retaliation will completely destroy Russia. And if the Americans don't win, there will be nothing to stop the white nationalists, which also will destroy Russia. And these ironies are referred to as a catch-22.